Well, Jesus Christ is the central figure when it comes to the New Testament. Jesus Christ is somebody who has had an amazing impact on history. In fact, some have argued that it is the teachings of Jesus Christ that have impacted just about every discipline that you can think of in terms of university or academic study. You look at the area of health, you look at the area of education, etc. The teachings of Jesus have impacted more than any other person. In fact, it was some years ago that Time magazine concluded that Jesus Christ is the man of history, the most influential figure in history. And I think there's very little that we could do to probably debate that. There's no question that more has been written about Jesus Christ than any other figure in history. Well, but that being said, there's a lot of different ideas. I mean, some people think that Jesus Christ was a good man, that he was a good teacher. Some say that he was a great teacher. Some say that he was a prophet. Now, some people say he was something more than a prophet. He was actually God himself. So as you can see, there are many different ideas. Well, what we want to work through is, look, what are the facts about Jesus Christ? What can we know? Well, the first thing is, I want to just establish the fact that there's no question that Jesus is a person of history. Because there have been, I guess not so many now, but people in the past have said, well, look, Jesus himself is a myth. There was no such person. Well, I think what's very clear is that Jesus indeed was a person of history. Let's have a look at some of the evidence. The evidence actually comes that Jesus existed from three different sources. We've got the New Testament writers, who of course were eyewitnesses. We have Roman historians, and we have Jewish writers. So let's have a look at some examples. We won't spend too long on this because I think it's something that can be established fairly quickly and with great certainty, but let's just run through some of the quotations. First of all, we have Tacitus, where he says, Christus, the founder of the name, was put to death by Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea, in the reign of Tiberius. So they're speaking of Christ and also a lot of associated historical facts around it. Then we have Plinius Secundus, writing in the early part of the 2nd century. Christians were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang a hymn to Christ as to a god. We have Josephus. At this time there was a wise man called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. And those who had become his disciples did not abandon their discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. As you can imagine, this particular quotation has been vigorously debated over the years. Because some people will say, well, look, Josephus, a Jew who was employed by the Romans, surely couldn't have written such a thing which was so highly complimentary and corroborative of the Christian story. And so this has gone backwards and forwards. I remember attending a seminar some years ago where the scholars were talking about this, and there was one scholar who was presenting that according to recent literary analysis of Josephus' material, that it was indeed highly credible and highly likely that this passage was indeed authentic. Because if you were to take it out, it would actually mess greatly with the literary style and structure of the rest of what he had there. Now, there are a couple of examples, actually a couple of versions of this particular statement. There is a Greek version which it's widely acknowledged may have been embellished through the centuries. But there's an Arabic version, which this particular one is based on, which actually is widely accepted as being genuine. So it's an interesting point about Josephus, but in any case, I think what is clear from it is that he's certainly highlighting the point that Jesus Christ was a real person of history. Now, this is a very interesting one from the Talmud. Now, sometimes some of the strongest evidence can come from critics or opponents. Now, note this one. It says, on the eve of Passover, they hanged Yeshu of Nazareth, in that he hath practiced sorcery and beguiled and led astray Israel. Now, of course, this is coming from a critical source of Jesus Christ. Now, let's unpack that quotation a little bit. Well, first of all, we know Yeshua in Hebrew is Jesus in Greek. Hanged, well, yeah, we know that Jesus died on a cross. And it was just before Passover feast, just as the Gospels say. Now, interestingly, he was accused of sorcery. Now, is that miracles? If someone's performing miracles, then an opponent would, I think quite understandably, label that as being sorcery. And so we have an interesting example here where a critical source can actually be used to add a lot of credibility to the claim that Jesus indeed was a real person of history. Then, of course, we've got the New Testament itself. And the New Testament, well, is overwhelming in its quantity of material that it speaks about Jesus Christ. Now, here's an example from 1 John. That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at and our hands have touched, this we proclaim concerning the word of life. The life appeared, we have seen it, and testify to it. We proclaim to you what we have seen and heard, so that you may also have fellowship with us. And our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. We write this to make your joy complete. So not only is the New Testament, as we looked at in a previous session, the most reliable body of writing in the ancient world, it is first-hand eyewitness material, but interestingly, it's written not to give us a historical document we can read for our own curiosity, but rather it's there for a purpose. We write this to make your joy complete. We write it so what? So you also may have fellowship with us. And our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. This is something that is written so that we can know Jesus Christ. So it's not just about him to establish that he was a person of history, but it has a further meaning than that. But this is the question. It's nice to establish that Jesus Christ was a figure of history. I don't think that's in any doubt whatsoever. But who was he? Was he indeed a good man, a great teacher, a prophet, or something more? Well, how can we find out? Well, doesn't it make sense to actually go to the actual words, what the person actually said about themselves? What's clear is that Jesus Christ claimed to be God. Now, that's just absolutely startling that somebody would what? Claim to be God. Well, we'll unpack that in a little while, but look, what's the evidence that Jesus claimed to be God? I mean, look, to make such a claim, surely we've got to have some evidence. Well, let's have a look. In John chapter 8, verse 58, Jesus said, "Before Abraham was born, I am." Well, okay. That's interesting, but look, is that significant? Is that him claiming to be God? Well, certainly the authorities, it says at this, they picked up stones to stone him, so they were certainly upset that he made this statement, "Before Abraham was born, I am." Well, interestingly, of course, Abraham lived many years before the time of Jesus Christ, and what's he doing? He's basically saying that he was alive, he was in existence before Abraham. But what we've got to remember is that in Exodus chapter 3 verse 14, this is a story where God appeared before Moses. And God said to Moses, "I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you." The interesting thing is, it is the same expression that Jesus uses in John chapter 8 as what God used in Exodus 3. And so what was very clear to the hearers was that Jesus Christ was claiming to be the I am that Jesus Christ was claiming to be God. And so is it any wonder then for blasphemy, at least that was their perception of it, they picked up stones to stone him. Well, let's have a look at another passage in Mark 14. "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," said Jesus, "and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming in the clouds of heaven." Continuing then, that passage, "The high priest tore his clothes. 'Why do we need any more witnesses?' he said. 'You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?' They all condemned him as worthy of death." There again, another passage where what Jesus said was clearly interpreted, where he was making a claim which was much more than claiming to be human. But let's have a look at one further passage, and this is in John chapter 10, verses 30 to 33. "I and the Father are one." Again, the Jews picked up the stones to stone him. But Jesus said to them, I have shown you many great miracles from the Father. For which of these do you stone me?" "We are not stoning you for any of these," replied the Jews, "but for blasphemy, because you, a mere man, claim to be God." The hearers were left with no misunderstanding what Jesus was claiming. They understood very well that Jesus was claiming to be God. Now, this is something which is very interesting. Because if someone claims to be God, well, they're either a madman, a con man, or telling the truth. And I'll unpack that. See, I don't know about you, but it's not very often that, at least I bump into someone who says that they are God. And if you were to bump into someone or meet up with someone who claims to be God, look, probably quite rightly, you'd be treating them, a little bit stand-backish. What do you say? I remember when I was a student, medical student, and I had to go through the psychiatric rotation. I spent, I think it was about 6 weeks where I attended, I think it was most days, I would spend time in a psychiatric hospital. And, taking histories, interacting with the patients, etc. there. Well, in that time, there were 1 or 2 who claimed to be God. And that was really quite an experience. But you know what, listening to them, it was very clear that they weren't, let's just say that their claim wasn't to be taken seriously. And this is where, unfortunately, people who make the claim that they are God, often there's other pathology involved at the same time, and sometimes for their own protection and protection of others, they need to be in an institution. So when someone claims to be God, well, look, that's really quite a significant claim. And seriously, in most cases, the evidence is so clear that they're not, it's very quickly dismissed. Now, in Jesus' case, it's very interesting because many people say he's a good person, a great man, all the rest, a prophet even. But look, if someone claims to be God, well, look, there's 3 alternatives. And look, how on earth do we get those 3 alternatives? These are based on, in a similar way to C.S. Lewis put forward that there were 3 alternatives, and he called them Lord, Liar, or Lunatic. And this is just, I guess, a similar but different terminology which says, well, look, a madman, a con man, or telling the truth. So let's look at it this way. Someone makes the claim, I am God. Well, there's 2 possibilities. Either it's true or it's not true. Yeah? Okay? 2 possibilities. Now, if it's true, we've got the 3rd one, haven't we? We've got the 3rd alternative where they're telling the truth. Now, if the claim is false, if they're actually telling us a lie, if they're claiming to God but they're not, again, there's 2 possibilities. Either the person making the claim knows that they're wrong, or they don't know that they're wrong. If they know they're wrong, well, they're trying to deceive us. They're a con man. If they don't know that they're wrong, let's say they genuinely think that they are God, but they're not, they're wrong, well, look, they're mad. There's something there. There's something not right. It's a pretty big claim to say that you are God and be totally mistaken about it. So that's where C.S. Lewis came up with the 3 categories, and as I say, that's just a different terminology for them. But you can see how, if someone makes that claim, there are the 3 alternatives. Either a madman, a con man, or they're telling the truth. This is where I think it's worthwhile just to spend a moment looking at each one and saying, look, is this a possibility when we apply it to Jesus Christ? Well, first of all, could it have been possible that Jesus was a madman? Well, what we know is that he performed amazing things and spoke amazing things. In fact, even if people believe him or don't believe in him, universally around the world, almost everybody agrees that he was a great teacher. In fact, the things that he taught have inspired millions. He's had a major impact on the world. In fact, when his opponents tried to trip him up with difficult questions, he answered brilliantly. He was even when his enemies hated him, he responded in a measured way. He wasn't prone to, fits of rage or responding in a way which was just crazy, that you might think might be typical of someone who may be mad. In fact, as people have studied Jesus' life, universally, they've come to the conclusion that he was a great man, that he was a great teacher, and many have even come to the conclusion that he was indeed a prophet, someone who had a message that we all need to hear. I think as we look at his life and his character and his influence, we can't come to the conclusion that he was a madman. It's just not a possibility. Well, what about the second possibility? Could he have been a con man? Well, the question is, to be a con man, you've got to have some sort of motive. He's trying to gain some advantage. Now, what advantage? Was he doing it for the money? Interestingly, well, look, he didn't go around with a whole bunch of money. That wasn't his aim. He wasn't trying to accumulate a lot of money. Was he doing it for the maybe popularity? Well, no. You remember that he rode into Jerusalem and he refused to be crowned king. That wasn't his calling. In fact, what about the power? Well, the same thing. There were people who wanted to make him king, but he refused to be made king of that area. That wasn't his calling, or it wasn't his purpose. So the motivation's not there. But this is the other difficulty if someone's trying to argue there was a con man. And that is that the Old Testament has a lot of predictions about what the Messiah would be like, and a lot about him. So, is it possible to fake it? Well, look, these predictions in the Old Testament, he has to arrive at the right time, has to be born in the right town, born from the right tribe, be killed at the right time by a specific method. At this stage, if you're a con man, you're running fast. Doesn't look good when you look at these predictions and you're trying to say, well, look, I'm going to fill these predictions, and even if I happen to be born at the right time, town and tribe, well, hey, guess what? Look, that death thing doesn't seem too exciting. You don't have a motive to do it anyway, and then by now you're running. But then there's a lot more of them. There's an interesting mathematician, philosopher, by the name of Peter Stoner, who worked out the chances. Because this is it. Let's say, what would be the possibility that someone randomly could actually fulfill this criteria? And this is not someone, the person who thinks, well, look, I'm going to give this a go because I somehow want to be, Messiah. But let's have a look at the chances. Now, Peter Stoner, he was a astronomer, and he published a writing in Science Speaks. And he looked at 8 different prophecies from the Old Testament concerning the Messiah. And he calculated what he considered to be very conservative possibilities or probabilities that the people in that part of the world, or even in the time since, could have fulfilled. So, for example, to be born in Bethlehem, there was only a certain number of people who could possibly fit that criteria. Other ones about the way that he died, by a specific method, crucifixion. How many people could have possibly fit that? Not that you want to be a con man. I mean, seriously, if crucifixion was, part of that prediction. But in any case, this wasn't, so these ones here, so that he looked at 8 prophecies and he calculated that someone, just by chance, being able to fulfill those, was one chance with 10 with 17 zeros afterwards. Now, what's that number mean? Look, remember, each additional number multiplies it by a factor of 10. Just to give, 2 examples what that means. Let's say that you had a piece of paper, you put it on the floor, you stacked them up one on top of the other, reached all the way to the moon. The number of pieces of paper would be 1, and it would have 12 zeros afterwards. So not 17, just 12. So it's a lot smaller number. Actually, the number which, the illustration we can use to approximate that number the best is, let's say that we considered all the grains of sand on the planet Earth. And we're talking about all the grains of sand of all the beaches, and we've got fabulous beaches nearby. All the beaches, not only in Australia but all the way around the world. All the beaches all the grains of sand on the beaches, under the oceans, in the deserts. That's the number of grains of sand you have. The point is that it is incredibly difficult to imagine that could have possibly happened by some random process. And even less so when you consider the real issue that why would someone choose to fake it when they consider that, part of it is death and there's no particular motive. Well, Peter Stoner actually did it one step further. He calculated the probabilities of 48 prophecies, because there are more than 48 actually in the Old Testament. Look, that's a number which has, I think I did count it once. There's over 100 zeros. That number is just unfathomable. To give you some comparison, the total number of subatomic particles in the known universe are 10 with 84 zeros afterwards. So this is a huge and much bigger number than that. The problem is that in the Old Testament, there's not just 48 prophecies that predict about the coming Messiah. There's actually over 200 of them. So we can see here there's something that is incredible, and something that I think is very strong evidence that Jesus Christ actually is the Messiah, because they point forward to the Messiah, and those prophecies were fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And what is significant is that Jesus Christ himself claimed to be the Messiah. He claimed to be God. What is interesting is to have a look at the words of C.S. Lewis. Fascinating guy, had a big impact on, I think, on the Christian world and the world generally in terms of literature. Certainly wrote, a lot of novels. The whole Narnia series is something which is well known and well loved by millions around the world. But he did a real investigation into the Christian faith because he didn't grow up a believer. He became a believer later in life. And as he examined this topic and the person of Jesus Christ, look what he says. He says, a man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on a level with the man who says he's a poached egg, or else he'd be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool. You can spit on him and kill him as a demon. Or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come up with any patronising nonsense about his being a great moral teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. I think it's a fascinating quotation because it really hits the nail on the head. That it's very difficult to say, on the one hand, that Jesus was a great man, he was a great teacher, but he wasn't God, when Jesus himself said, I'm God. Effectively, that's what he was saying. He made the claim that he's God. Now, the point is, if there's someone who claims to be God, and of course at other times he made other claims, he's saying, I am the way, to the truth and the life, no one comes to the Father except through me. He's making claims to be able to forgive sins. He makes claims also that there would be people with him in heaven, in paradise. There's many claims that he makes. Now, these aren't claims that just simply a human good teacher would make. These are claims which is something extraordinary. So there's something going on here, that indeed either Jesus is at that complete package where he is everything that he claims to be, or you couldn't just argue he's just a great person or a great teacher. We can't just go that way. We need to take seriously the claims that he made about himself and look at that total context. As we look at the scripture here in Matthew, sorry, it's just cut off there. But what about you, he asked. Who do you say I am? Simon Peter answered, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. See, the disciples were in no doubt as to who Jesus was. The thing is, we too can have that confidence. There's no question that Jesus was a person of history. There's no question, as we saw in the previous session, that the New Testament is reliable. There's no question that Jesus rose from the dead. There's no question that Jesus claimed to be God. There's also no question that the evidence is there that Jesus indeed is God. So, what can we say about Jesus? There is much that we can say about Jesus. But what we can be is affirmed in the faith that is given to us and expressed through those who knew Jesus Christ, those who lived with him for 3.5 years, those who saw him after he rose from the dead. And of course, it's not just an academic question, it's a question that is significant for every one of us. It's because of who Jesus is and because of what he did for us that we can accept his free gift of salvation, and also we can look forward to spending an eternity with him.